In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Daily Memphian Tigers Podcast with Greg Gaston. I'll be joined today by Parth Upadhyaya. He's the Tigers basketball beat writer for the Daily Memphian, and Tim Buckley, the Daily Memphian deputy sports editor and senior writer. And just like last week, we are on remote today. In fact, we're in three different areas as this is being put together. So it may not sound as crisp as in the past, but I'm sure it will sound very well, very fine, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. But again, I just want to make sure, in case you're wondering, it doesn't sound like they're in the same studio. We are not. We are at three different remote areas putting together this week's podcast. The Tigers, of course, have now lost two in a row after dropping one in New Orleans against Tulane on Sunday, 81-79. Their third straight loss at Fogelman Arena. They are now 15-4, 4-2 in American Conference play. That right now puts them seventh in the standings, believe it or not, with 12 games left to go in the regular season. As far as the Associated Press poll this week, which Parth has a vote in, the Tigers did not fall out of the poll. They are at number 19. Well, guys, first of all, as always, it's great to talk to you about the Tigers. Parth, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Enjoyed the trip to New Orleans despite the Tigers' loss, so that was cool. And looking forward to kind of the week off here, the bye week.
Tim, how are you?
Fantabulous.
Well, you're doing a lot better than I think Tigers fans are doing right now.
Yeah.
They don't know whether to pull their hair out, to jump off the Hernando de Soto Bridge. I say don't do that. Everything will be fine. At least Penny hopes so. I know last night Parth was his weekly radio show. We'll get to some of his comments in just a moment. You wrote about that, and you can check that out at the Daily Memphian. But I want to open up with the way I pretty much closed last week's podcast. I asked you, what was the concern meter after they blew that 20-point lead against USF and lost at home? Parth, I think you were around a 6.5. I forget what Tim was, but right now, same question. What is the concern meter about these Tigers at this point right now, riding the two-game losing streak?
Yeah, I said 6.5 last week. I think obviously that's risen a little bit. I'd put it at a 7.5 now, and it's all contextual, right? Because the Tulane game was one I predicted to be a loss anyway, and I think, a lot of folks considered that one a coin toss, going into the season, just because they've had their struggles there. In Fogelman Arena, they've had their struggles against Ron Hunter's teams with the way they play. But I think it's the fact that these losses are compounding, right? Like you got the loss to Tulane just days before. You have the 20-point meltdown to South Florida at home. So those combined, we've seen have taken Memphis down a seed line or two. There was a lot of bracketology projections that had them at a 4 or a 5. Now it's looking like a 6 and a 7, if you look across the board there. So yeah, I'd say about a 7.5.
Tim?
Well, I'll tell you this much. I'm not pulling my hair out, mostly because I can't afford to at this stage in life. But I mean, for me personally, it doesn't matter one way or the other. For them, if it was at 6.5 before Tulane, I'd say it's definitely at 7, maybe part 7.5 right now. Mm-hmm. They just you just got to wait and see and see if they can get their act together. I don't buy into the notion, and I'm sure we can talk about this a little later, Parth, but I don't buy into the notion that they're on track for missing the NCAA tournament field. That seems kind of ridiculous to me. But you have another 3 like you had the last 2, and then I'll buy that argument.
But the point is that this is not about whether or not they'll make the tournament. Hopefully we're not talking about that more seriously in the weeks to come. The point of this whole season and the schedule we put together was to avoid the 8-9 game, even the 7-10 game, get as high a seed as possible. They did everything they could do in the non-conference portion of their schedule. It's not Penny's fault. It's not the team's fault that the teams they beat have all lost a lot of games and have not lived up to their expectations. but now they are giving it away. They're giving it back. These are Penny's words, not mine.
In the last week, I think they've played themselves from arguably from the 4-5 range, smack dab into the 8-9 range.
Jerry Palm, I can tell you this because he comes on my radio show weekly. Last week, when Memphis moved up to 10th in the AP poll, had them as a 3 seed. He now has them as a 7 seed. He's dropped them down 4 lines. Lenardi, DeCourcy didn't have them as high, but they have them as a 6 seed, as you just alluded to, Parth. So right there, 6, 7, okay, but 7 gets you the 7-10. Another loss, if it's not Florida Atlantic, probably drops you into the 8-9 game. And God forbid if there's another bad loss somewhere down the road. So while the concern meter for you guys is, and again, you don't have a dog in the fight, but in covering this team, just kind of visualizing what the concern meter should be around 7, 7.5. The fans have to be concerned because another loss or two, then you really are talking about a team being on the bubble.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that's the issue, Greg. Like you said, this season wasn't about just getting into the tournament, as it's been for the past 2 seasons. 2 seasons ago, they had that kind of epic meltdown collapse, whatever you want to call it. They sat at 9-8, got blown out by SMU, and Penny had those stupid effing comments to our Jeff Calkins. But that's not what this is about, right? It's not about just squeaking into the tournament as a 7 seed, as an 8 seed, as a 9 seed. This was about assembling this loaded roster, which it is a loaded roster still. It's still talent-wise probably a top 15 roster in my opinion. And the goal was to get a top 4, if not top 5 seed, get to the Sweet 16, if not further. And now it seems like a lot of fans are moving those goalposts back, right? Is that fair to say? I've seen a lot of,
yes,
they're still going to make the tournament. They're still going to get into the big dance. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is this was not the goal. This is not what we discussed. This is not what was talked about back in August, September, and October.
They finished games. Go ahead, Tim.
I say, and it is still a loaded talent team, but it's one that's down one and a huge one that I think is contributing to at least some of what we've seen the last couple of games with Caleb Mills being out. They gotta make up that difference somehow, as they start to get serious in February and March.
And Parth, he alluded to that. Penny did last night at his coach's show.
He did. He talked about Caleb Mills not only being his absence being felt on the defensive end, but just in terms of his leadership. No, he did. And he talked about much more than Caleb Mills' impact on the court. He talked about Caleb Mills as an emotional leader. That's those are his words, not mine. As a vocal leader, as somebody who stepped up and separated himself from that group. Because, it's hard when you bring in a whole new roster. They brought in 13 new players with only Jaden Hardaway and Malcolm Dandridge returning. Obviously, Jaden and Malcolm are, solid players, but they're not really guys who have been stars or have been focal points of teams in the past. So it's hard to kind of have that natural alpha. Well, Caleb Mills was that, right? Like, even though he wasn't starting, even though he wasn't scoring the most points in the team, he was a guy that, when things kind of went south in huddles, when arguments started, when guys were being selfish, to use Penny's words, Caleb kind of reeled them in and reminded them what this was all about, what the goals were. Well, he's not there anymore, right? Like, not only is he not on the court, but he's not on the sidelines either. I'm guessing he's either back home recovering or here in Memphis somewhere doing some recovery stuff. But, his absence has been felt, and, we've seen it defensively. We've seen it in terms of this thing kind of faltering or falling apart in terms of chemistry and locker room connection, which Penny has said multiple times over the past week since that USF loss.
So when you look at this team in totality, early in the year, they were able to finish games. Then as the season progressed, especially when they got into conference play, it was down to the wire where Javon Quinterly pulled them out with heroic 3-point shots. So they were winning by razor close margins. Now they are having a tough time finishing games. And you can go back to the non-conference game against Ole Miss, a tough one on the road. They had an 11-point lead. They lost that one. But in conference play, a USF team, they had down 20. They weren't able to keep the lead. They lose the game down to the wire. Tulane, they had a 7-point lead with 6 minutes to go. Unable to win in the end. What is the difference, Tim, that now they can't finish when they could finish earlier in the year?
Well, one was just bad luck because, Quinterly got off that long 3-pointer that was pretty much headed toward the basket and just off by a smidge. So, that was a narrow one there.
In the USF game, right?
Yeah, the rest of it, look, the Tulane, I mean, it's been chronicled. The last 4 minutes of it, no field goals. They didn't have, I looked it up, they didn't have an assist on a made field goal in the last 5 minutes and change of the game. They had 8 assists total. They completely they had great ball movement, early in that game. They were pounding it inside, which was their game plan. They had some nice ball reversal. Everybody was getting a touch. Everybody was involved in the flow of the offense. Right under the 7-minute mark, and Penny Hardaway alluded to it, and I broke it down. Actually, I went back and I looked at the last 10 possessions, and I wrote about this in something that's going to be up shortly if it's not already. Right under the 7-minute mark, they had 2 possessions where Quinterly went one-on-one and Jones went one-on-one. And it was just like they had completely gotten away from everything that had success, with in the first half. And they went from like 6 up to 1 down. It was like a 7-point swing in just a flash. And it was because of that. And they just fell back on old bad habits. That kind of has been an earmark for them for, a large part of the season. And sometimes they've gotten away with the selfishness, and this time it bit them.
They had the flagrant one called against Quinterly, which wasn't originally, it was originally just a common foul, and that was upgraded to a flagrant one. That was a big difference in that game. He turned the ball over 6 times as well. Quinterly's been really, really good for the most part this season, but he had an off game. Yet they were still right there with a chance to win. But you had some oddities going on, Parth. You were in New Orleans. You had Penny going to his son, Ashton, cold off the bench in what looked like a design play where he was either the first or second option to take a 3, and he didn't make that. You had Jaden, who I guess was thrust into big minutes because of injuries, and he had that runner that missed wildly towards the end of the game. He ended up taking the second most shots of any Tiger in that game, which is unbelievable when you think about it. So there were some decisions that were made personnel-wise. Maybe that last play call, which was with David Jones shooting a 26-footer, when I thought maybe they could have drove and kicked and got a better 3-point attempt as they looked like they were going for the win. How did you see it down there, watching it live, the execution or lack thereof of the Tigers down the stretch with a chance still to win the basketball game?
Yeah, the execution was poor, obviously, on both ends of the floor. But the last play, I've seen a lot of criticism, about that last play, about going for the win and about taking a long 3-pointer there. Well, he had 32 points, right? And was shooting over 50% from the floor and 50% from 3 leading up to that. He had the hot hand. It was a clean look. I mean, I was fine with that play in particular, but it's everything else that, has got to bother you if you're a Tigers fan. One that sticks out, one play is that Sion James. I think I'm pronouncing his first name correctly. Sion.
Yes. Sion.
Sion. Just wide open, man. On the inbounds play in that left corner. David Jones went for the steal. I think it was Jalen Forbes who was there on the left wing. He thought the ball was coming there. Obviously, it was not. It's just stuff like that, right? That's just undisciplined play. And as many points as David Jones has, I think this was the first game. Maybe not the first game, but the most obvious game where you looked at him and you said, maybe he's giving up more points than he's scoring, despite the 32-point night. Which is certainly concerning. Then, Jaquan Walton goes down at halftime, which I think is why we saw, the Hardaways play more. They needed shooting late, and they were kind of out of options, right? There was no Jaquan Walton, no Caleb Mills. Naquan Tomlin got poked in the eye. He couldn't play. So a team that's, that we've credited as being deep, as being, at times having 8 starter caliber players, rather, they didn't have that anymore. So they had to go to guys like Ashton Hardaway, and they had to rely on Jaden Hardaway much more than you probably wanted to in that kind of game.
The David Jones one was ridiculous. I mean, he
Absolutely.
obviously that was what was planned. He was going to cheat, but he started to cheat before the kid even threw the ball in. It was like it was. I mean, it was like a Globetrotters play where, like, if that had happened, somebody would have blown a whistle and somebody else would have snuck up behind him and pulled his pants down because that's how he got caught. I mean, that one was just nuts. And the Quinterly one, that was a frustration foul because I think that was when he tried to do the pick and roll with Dandridge, was it? I might be mixing that one up. But anyway, he got caught behind, and he just tried to give him a little nudge from behind and thought he can get away with it to disrupt the fast break, and he got caught red-handed. And so, yeah, little miscues like that. And I think the presence of Jaquan Walton, or lack thereof, in the second half, it showed. I mean, it was kind of unfair. Look, Ashton Hardaway was wide open, and he was in there probably partly because of Walton and partly also because he's a shooter. But to ask him to come in and take a shot, even if he was that open, that big, in that circumstance, probably was a little unfair to anybody, no matter what your last name is, coming in that cold.
Look, I think you guys make great points. There is no question about it. They missed Jaquan Walton. First of all, he has his shot back and he was making shots. But second of all, he's a big guy. He's a good perimeter defender, not as good as Caleb Mills, but it gives you some help on the perimeter. But with David Jones and Javon Quinterly, but especially with David Jones, that's what you got. David Jones may be a little bit better defensive player than what he has shown because he gambles so much, but at least the guy gets you rebounds. He had 11 rebounds, so he is doing something on the defensive side. He's just not a great man-to-man defender, but he's a great offensive player. You're not going to pull him out of the game. Quinterly's your quarterback. Sometimes he's off. He had an off game. Most of the time he's on. He's not the greatest man-to-man defender either. So it's other guys that are going to have to pick up the slack. And the problem is communication. They continue to struggle with help defense. They're not guarding the perimeter. I know Jourdain was under the weather, so he was making mistakes. The one time on the inbounds pass, he left to go defend, to double up a guy and left the guy wide open in the corner for a three. I mean, this is the biggest problem. And when Penny Hardaway took over as the head coach 6 years ago, all he did was stress defense. And his defense has been pretty good over his run for the most part. He thinks this team could be a good defensive team. They haven't shown it, Parth. And I know that was something he talked about last night and you wrote about, as this week they're going to stress a lot about those defensive schemes that maybe he didn't go hard enough with these players in past practices because he has this whole week to get it right.
No, absolutely. And he said it before. He said it back in, I think it was early December when they lost to Ole Miss, the fact that the way he wants to play defense, that half circle defense, I think is what he calls it, which is like a 3/4 court press, essentially. He hasn't been doing a lot of that. A lot of that schematic stuff has not been implemented just because he missed those 3 games. But I think, look, and now we're in January. Like, missing those 3 games back in November is not an excuse anymore. We're 2 months removed from that. So to point to that and say, hey, this is why I didn't, do X or Y or implement these plays or schemes, like, that's not, this is not valid in my opinion at this point in the season, especially with 12 games remaining. I think he
well, and if I can interject, Parth,
yeah,
and he was still able to coach during practice then. It was just the games that he missed.
He was. That's a good point, Tim. That's actually a great point.
Anyway, go ahead.
People forget that. Yeah. And I think it's partially that, maybe that is a reason there. Although he was able to coach in practice, he was not able to coach in those 3 games. But like we said, it's been weeks since that point. But I think it's more so just kind of at times, I think Penny felt too comfortable with the fact that he had all these talented guys that were, 5th, some 6th year guys, including Javon Quinterly, that he felt would kind of, I don't want to say go on autopilot, but kind of figure it out themselves when it came to defense, even when it came to offense at times, kind of figuring out that pecking order. And neither thing has been figured out. The defense certainly has not. And at times we've seen the pecking order not been figured out when they're going like, one-on-one in stretches of games and taking turns instead of moving, within the flow of the offense and the thing looking more cohesive and fluid.
Is it a coincidence that since his arrival, they have struggled, especially on the defensive end? I'm not putting this blame on Naquan Tomlin. I think he, at times, has been terrific. He's also fouled out of a few games. but he's been getting more minutes and more minutes and more minutes. He's a very talented player. But is it a coincidence? Let me start with you, Tim, that since his arrival, these struggles have occurred.
Yeah, I do think it is a coincidence. I mean, yeah, maybe he was a smidge out of shape, and maybe they did some things technique wise, just a little bit different than he was accustomed to dealing with at Kansas State compared to here, and so he had some catch up on that. But basketball is basketball. I mean, and I think he's been not just a little, but way more of a help than a hindrance.
I agree.
Especially with Jordan Brown not around. But going back to the work him harder in practice this week and everything, he had a reference too where when everybody was kind of searching for answers to the slow starts and coming up largely empty. They had a little stretch there where they had some really hard practices that he had referenced. And I asked him if kind of like in the NBA vein, when you have like super veteran clubs with older guys that, on the college basketball equivalent, you have like a Quinterly battling with his knee issues. And like Parth said, Mills, that his hip thing, before his season ending injury and all that. Like the NBA teams would dial back practices and not even think about having the older guys go hard. And then you compound it with the fact that, college basketball is a little bit different schedule wise. And so how do you factor? Because they came off a tough stretch where they were doing a lot of travel and playing a bunch of games in a short period of time around Thanksgiving and all that. And Penny didn't bite at that at all. He pondered it for a second, and then he was like, "No," he says, "because I was easy on him earlier." But some NBA teams take that approach. They just dial it down in practice instead of going crazy.
One of the positives, certainly in that loss to Tulane, was the play of Malcolm Dandridge, who was playing the best basketball of his career, a career high over 31 minutes played. He went for 13 points. 8 rebounds, 8 blocks. Now, he fouled out late in that game, and certainly you could throw that into the many factors of maybe why this team lost. But Malco was tremendous. I personally believe that Malco had a little extra in the giddy-up because of the Jordan Brown news. Parth, Jordan was there, never stepped onto the court to play. I don't know if you've got more information from Penny as to really what the goals are with Jordan moving forward, how the players have accepted him. But Malco was crazy good in that game.
No, he was sensational. And Penny said it last night that Malcolm Dandridge was one of the only reasons that they stayed in that game. And I think he's right? Like David Jones scored 32, Malcolm scored 13. Nobody else, I don't think, cracked even double digits in points. Or actually, I'm sorry, Jaquan Walton had 11 and Javon Quinterly had 11. But certainly nobody else exceeded that 13-point mark, which is not ideal, right? Like when you're playing in that kind of game where, it's up and down, it's in the high 70s, low 80s there. So yeah, Malco did all he could. It certainly seemed like he was playing with some motivation, a chip on his shoulder after, he was benched. He was benched the last 4 or 5 minutes of the South Florida game. Penny had his comments. Penny did not say Malcolm's name directly, but we all kind of put those clues together and had our own speculations on, on sports talk radio and in columns and in writing and all that stuff. Malcolm sees that stuff, right? Like he sees it on Twitter. And we talked about it after the formal press conference. Him and I were just kind of walking out of the media room, and other reporters were as well. And he said that basically, people read into things too much, and it gets frustrating, whether it's he had an Instagram post. I don't know if you guys saw that, but he had an Instagram post the day that they traveled to New Orleans. I guess that would have been Saturday, where he had song lyrics that were, in his words, misinterpreted, interpreted as if he was saying that, he doesn't get along with his teammates or that somebody's, kind of backstabbing him or whatever the case may be. He was just kind of laughing about it, laughing how much, detective work is being done, by media and by fans. So I do think that he saw that stuff. I do think that motivated him. And as far as Jordan Brown, Penny said afterward that, the plan was to not play him at all that game. In fact, Jordan asked to not play. He felt he wasn't fully reintegrated into the system yet. And he didn't feel comfortable kind of going out there without having done the I guess what he felt was adequate 5-on-5 work. So that was the reasoning for that. It'll be interesting to see though, how long it takes Jordan to get into the mix again. They have a week off now, so I'd expect to see him certainly against UAB. I was told that he would play minimal minutes against Tulane. Obviously, that did not happen, and Penny said that was never the plan. So that is that. But I think that's going to be another factor, like we've talked about. Yet another component that you're trying to integrate back in. A guy who hasn't been there for 11 games. So it's gonna be a process again, and we'll see how that turns out.
As far as reading too much into stuff, there's one easy solution for that. Stay off social media. Like from the day the season starts to the day the season ends.
Easier said than done for these young men. And young women.
Sure.
And you know what? And if you're the head coach, you say, okay, here's the rule, stay off social media. If you want to be on it, go to that portal thing because I'm done with you.
Yeah, I hear you. You're old school. I'm old school, but I don't know. I don't know if it works in this day and age. And that's not Penny. That's not in his DNA. It's not his style.
Of course it doesn't work, but we can all, hope. There's still hope for the world, isn't there?
There is hope for the world. And there's hope for this team because one thing about Penny's teams, each and every year he's been the head coach, they have played better as the season has progressed. And normally they're playing their best basketball by the time the conference tournament comes around and postseason play comes around. And hopefully that is the case for their sake. But it's not going to be an easy turnaround. They're integrating Jordan Brown back. They're dealing with some injuries. They've lost 2 in a row. I don't believe Penny and Penny's teams have lost 3 in a row in his tenure. I could be wrong about that, but they turn around and play UAB. The old rivalry is back. Andy Kennedy, their head coach, who played against Memphis as a player and coached against them at Ole Miss, at Cincinnati. He knows all about Memphis. That place will get rowdy at Bartow Arena. And I believe, gentlemen, they're at a crossroads in the season. Right now, this game, although I'm not going to sit here and say you have to win it or you're not going to the tournament, I think it's a pivotal game. It's an absolutely pivotal game to show you if you're going in the right trajectory. How do you see this one, Parth? They've had the week just started, but they're going to have a whole week to prepare for the enemy Sunday in Birmingham.
Yeah, I think it's a must win. And Greg, like you said, it's not a must win in terms of, if you lose this, you're not going to go to the tournament. You're going to go to the NIT. No, nobody's saying that. But, if you lose that game, all of a sudden you're looking at these bracketology projections, you're looking at these analysis pieces, whatever, and they'll be pegged in that 8-9 game again, if they lose that game. And they'll have, no margin for error. They have slim margin for error now. But if you mess around and lose to the Blazers, you can't, at that point, you got to win out, right? You got to go win out. You got to go win the conference tournament. And that's very, very hard to do. They haven't shown us any indication that they can do that at this point. So I think they've got to grab this one, especially knowing that you've got games against Florida Atlantic, 2 of them coming up. You got a game against SMU on the road, another tough team, a team that's emerged kind of surprisingly. North Texas has been good. So with those, what is that? 2 against FAU, 2 against North Texas, 1 against SMU. Those 5 games coming up, you kind of got to get them when you can. And aside from that, Greg, like you said, they've lost 2. I don't think they've lost 3 in a row either, in conference play under Penny Hardaway. So they would be kind of uncharted territory for the Tigers if they do that. And I think that's when you start to see kind of things spiraling out of control, if they're not out of control already.
Tim?
The crazy thing, we're talking about the number 19 team in the country, despite its 2 losses, one that's lost only 4 games, 19 into the season. And we're like nitpicking, which
there's
no way they should be 19th though, right? Like
I don't think it's nitpicking. Yeah,
but they are. They're 19th or the 25th.
But that doesn't mean anything. The polls don't mean anything.
Oh no, that's nonsense. No. They do.
I don't think the polls mean much, man. Like look at how these people have voted. Like, are they even watching college basketball? I think that's a fair question. If you look at, kind of the votes and how some of these pollsters have voted throughout these weeks.
Who's on the committee that does all the seating?
I don't know the members.
A bunch of really old guys who grew up with the poll and shake their head at all this computer stuff, and half of whom probably like have somebody else Google stuff for them because they don't know how to do it.
No, you're right. You're right. There is something to that.
Oh, Tim, you sound like get off my lawn guy more than me. I mean, no, it's not just old people anymore. They're looking at all the analytics. They'll take the poll into consideration. But here's the thing. One more loss and Memphis is out of the top 25, and then we can stop talking about that. Do you guys think they're going to run the table? You think they're running the table? Here's the thing, too. Memphis with 4 losses is not equivalent to a Power 5 conference with a team with 4 losses. It's not the same.
Greg. Thank you.
It's not the same.
Fans don't get that, man. I don't know what's going on.
Even though Memphis is capable of beating a lot of those teams, I'm not saying they're not. I'm not saying they're not a talented team. But the problem is you lose to UAB on Sunday, I don't even know where they'll be projected for the NCAA tournament. Maybe even outside looking in. You can be a Big 12 team right now with 4 losses and lose 3 more games and still be comfortably in the NCAA tournament. That's the problem, Tim. And as Parth alluded to, SMU, we know how close that was. They got to go down there. UAB won't be a picnic. You got to play home and home in Florida Atlantic. There are some other teams that seem to be getting better and better in this conference right before our very eyes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're totally right. Just cancel the season.
No, don't cancel the season. I'm just saying they need to win. We were talking about before the season started, all right, you got to go out there. You got to take care of business in non-conference. They did. So then it was like, all right, that's a breather. Now they're going into conference play. This is a crap conference. Everybody talked about how crappy the conference was with the exception of Florida Atlantic. So they go in there. They lose a 20-point lead at home to USF. They lose a road game against Tulane. And Parth, I'm with you. I had them losing that game against Tulane.
Yep.
But I had them losing a total of 3. Now, I think they're going to split with Florida Atlantic, and then you still got a conference championship game if both those teams are successful enough to get there. But I'm a little concerned about a couple of these other games. The SMU game in Dallas, certainly one of them. I'm a little concerned about Sunday. That's why, Tim, I think this is absolutely a pivotal week. Cal used to call it Camp Cal during the week when they didn't have a game until 1 week apart. It's Camp Penny. Penny knows that it's Camp Penny. This game on Sunday is absolutely pivotal. If they go down there and they play really well and beat UAB soundly, I think Tigers fans should feel really, really good. On the flip side, if there's struggles again, there's big-time concern because we're almost into February, and Penny's teams usually are improving, not regressing.
I agree with you that it's pivotal. I think if you get to the title game of a conference tournament, they're just fine. But I will say this. For all the talk about how crappy the conference is, and maybe it's partially skewed by the fact that Memphis hasn't looked good against a bunch of teams, but I think this conference is a little bit better than a lot of people give it credit for.
I agree.
I agree.
I mean, Charlotte is playing now. We're taping this. It's Tuesday. Charlotte's playing UAB tonight. I'm interested in that one because Charlotte has actually played very well in their return to the conference. Now, of course, the American, they played in Conference USA with Memphis, but they've returned and they have played well at home. They beat Florida Atlantic at home. I'll be curious to see how that one goes. And I do see improvement. With South Florida. SMU's always a tough out. And of course, they're leaving the conference. Tulane has always been tough on Memphis, but I did not expect Memphis on a bounce back game on Sunday after the debacle against USF to lose that game. And the bottom line is they lost that game. Down the stretch, they were outplayed. Some would say they were outcoached. They can't have a lot of that in conference play or it's going to be a black eye. That's all I'm saying. Parth?
No, I agree. And I think the warning signs have always been there. And Malcolm Dandridge said it himself. Penny Hardaway said it himself. That through that 10-game winning streak, the back half of that, like the vibe in the locker room, according to Penny last night, his radio show, was as if they lost, right? Because Memphis has been superiorly has had the most talent on the floor in those 5 games. And I think that would be what Austin Peay, Tulsa, UTSA, USF. So even when they were winning those games, like it wasn't like they were doing it convincingly. Like all the signs were there, the same concerns that were there then, the same issues they had are happening now. The basketball gods just aren't blessing them with the Javon Quinterly game winners anymore, right? So I think, nothing has changed over the past 23 days of this new calendar year. And I think that's the most concerning thing. And now you're talking about locker room issues. So nothing Memphis has done, and I wrote this in my AP poll how I voted story. Like nothing Memphis has done over the past 3 to 5 weeks has shown us that they're a top 25 team, right? And I think that is more concerning than anything else.
I don't necessarily know that Penny should be shocked that they lost, because he basically hinted at it after that first loss when he says, I don't know if this is a wake-up call.
Yep.
Right. Right.
He basically sensed it happening again. But one of the reasons why I say that we're nitpicking and all that is, you know what? If Quinterly's shot is 2 inches to the right, and if David Jones's shot is maybe 2.5 inches shorter than it was on that NBA range 3-pointer that he picked up, they win both those games. Yes, they're cutting it way closer than they should. They're putting themselves in position that they shouldn't be putting themselves in, but they're within, less than a foot of having won both of those games.
Well, they're still playing bad basketball, right? Like that's the thing.
Yeah. They're playing bad basketball.
Yes, agreed.
But to Tim's point, and he's right? But on the flip side, there are 3 inches from Quinterly not making the 1-3, Quinterly 3 inches from not making the other 3, and they could have easily lost those games. And I'm telling you, if right now we're talking about the Tigers being 13-6, they're like the last 4 out. They're not even in the tournament. And that would be crazy after what they did in November and December. I mean, it seems like it's ages ago that they beat Clemson. I looked at Jerry Palm's bracketology this week. I already told you he dropped them from a 3 to a 7. That's in 1 week. He has them playing New Mexico. Again, it won't turn out this way, but I'm just saying for the sake of this discussion, he's got them number 7 playing number 10 New Mexico. Right? If they win, they play the winner of Morehead State, Clemson. He's got Clemson as a 3 seed. Remember when Memphis beat Clemson and then drilled Virginia? It seems like it was 2 years ago.
It does.
You know what I hate?
Yeah,
absolutely. I hate the what if game. Like, what if I had ran back inside and grabbed that bottle of water? Then, I probably wouldn't have been speeding when the cops
just said, what if the inches,
corner.
if they just,
what
if the shot went in for Jones?
Oh, I know. I started it and I hate it.
Do that. That's what we do. It's a lot of
charge.
No, but Greg, I think, you talk about those wins being ages ago, that 3-game stretch when we thought they were world beaters, right? They went to College Station, Texas. They beat Texas A&M. Then they beat Clemson. They beat Virginia. They throttled Virginia, not just beat them. They destroyed Virginia. But I think it's, you look at the data points we've seen since then, and then you look at the data points we found out about those teams, about Texas A&M, about Clemson, about Virginia, especially about Virginia, just not being that good. Like Virginia is not going to make the NCAA tournament. Neither is Arkansas. Neither is Michigan. Neither is Missouri. We talked about those wins like they mattered back in November, December. Quite frankly, they don't. The two that matter are Texas A&M and Clemson. And I think the list stops there. And that's the problem. Like it's the lack of a resume now. The resume being watered down, along with the analytics that haven't looked good for 5 weeks, along with the eye test, which also hasn't looked good for 3, 4, 5 weeks. And all of that together, plus the chemistry issues, plus the addition of Jordan Brown, those are the problems, right? Like they have to get all that sorted out. And we're sitting in late January. It's not like we're in late November or late December. We're, over halfway into the season and stuff is not sorted out, nor has it looked like it's going to get sorted out anytime soon. I could be wrong, and for the Tigers' sake, I hope I am wrong.
And I'll say this, and I think we're all in agreement on this, even though I don't want to speak for you guys, I will. Penny Hardaway put together what he thought was a great non-conference schedule. He did the job going out there and finding schools that wanted to play him, schools that had cachet, other teams that he wanted to play, other schools said no, they wanted to do neutral court or not play them at all. So he put that schedule. It is not his fault that they have all fallen on hard times.
Not at all. No. He did the right thing on a whole bunch of different fronts, trying to help them seed wise, trying to harden them, trying to give them true tests. I suppose the only lesson in all of it is just schedule a bunch of crappy teams and hope they're good instead.
All right, guys. Hey, listen, so what are we talking about next week? Are we talking about them getting off the schneid, beating UAB in Birmingham? Or are we going to be talking about an unprecedented third straight conference loss for Penny Hardaway's teams?
I think we're talking about a turnaround. I think this team is too good, as we've discussed, in terms of talent. They've got a week off. Penny has, promised, vowed, whatever you want to call it, to go hard on them, to have like a boot camp. Like you said, what'd you call it, Greg? Penny camp, Camp Penny, whatever.
Camp Penny.
So Penny has said it's going to be Camp Penny, from now until Friday when they travel to Birmingham. So I think we've got to take his word for it. Like Penny Hardaway, his teams have not lost 3 straight, I don't believe, in conference play. I got to look that up and double check, but this is not something that Memphis teams have done under him. This team is way too talented to just kind of falter and, as Tim said, cancel the season. So I think we're going to be in here, next Tuesday talking about, a turnaround, or at least the start of one.
Tim, you agree?
Well, I think we're going to be talking about what barbecue we had in Birmingham. Did we go Dreamland? Did we go Jim and Nick? Did we go the Pit?
Are you gonna eat bar? I mean, it's not bad down there. I've had Dreamland before, but really, you're gonna go down there and eat barbecue? Is that what you're gonna eat?
It depends where my chauffeur takes me.
Parth, they're paying you to be a chauffeur.
I was gonna say, does that mean they add that to my job title?
Well, listen. Safe travels down there. Again, we'll see. Crossroads, there's no question. This is a crossroads game. It's going to be a raucous fan base and in Bartow Arena, and should be a lot of fun. Parth, thank you as always. Make sure to read Parth's great stories, of course, at the Daily Memphian. Thank you, Parth.
Thanks, y'all.
Mr. Buckley, as always, it's been a pleasure. I love our lively debate.
Thank you, Gregory.
We appreciate it. And folks, make sure to check out all our other podcasts here at the Daily Memphian. The Daily Memphian's food podcast, Sound Bites. It's hosted by Chris Harrington and Holly Whitfield. The Sidebar with Eric Barnes is about arts, culture, and everything in between. And the Grizzlies podcast, also hosted by Chris Harrington with Drew Hill. All of our podcasts are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find podcasts. So once again, big shout out to our producer extraordinaire, Natalie Van Gundy, for putting this together. Again, we are on remote today, all 3 of us in different places, actually all 4 of us in different places, and she's going to make it sound as good as she can, and she always does a great job. Until next week, have a great one, everyone.